you think we're overlooking then as well small local companies that simply don't have a department who can sit and fill in complex forms in the level of detail that you're talking about, because actually they're just really good at doing their job, which could be, you know, building buses, and it could be digging roads. I mean, I don't know, but
fixing roofs. Mrs. Barber, if some of my colleagues who did the day-to-day were here, they would say that the current process appears to favour those who can employ an administrator, who can learn the system, work it, and there's nothing wrong with understanding the system that you're due to score against. A number of you are familiar with audits of a whole range of sorts. The more you understand what you're being measured against, the better you do. Some firms have invested in exactly that, Mrs. Barber. They've got someone who read the rules, knows the portal, looks at it every day, sees every single opportunity. There are other firms that I'm sure are equally good at fixing the roof or replacing the joinery or laying the tarmac. They don't bid. And so when it comes down to, and your clerk advised me, wanted to talk about what people think of it, there are some people who are saying they'd almost rather go through the full procurement of a tender than a quick quote, because it's clearer and more work's been done on the specification and they know what they're bidding against. There are others who say it just isn't worth it. And and that's not just small firms. We have to procure from around the world because, I've just listed 2 German gearboxes. You know, we have to get bits from companies like that. We have to get all sorts of things from a global supply chain. As you know, there's a default position that we should, where possible, have contracts under Manx law. So I've placed an order last Friday for 3 high-value items, and I had to get the Attorney General's Chamber's permission, which was granted, that we could transact under American law. The firm, his last order was for 1,200 units. We've ordered 3. I don't think they're going to rewrite their standard contract to deal with us. And there's no fault here with the colleagues in Chambers. We put a position and they've agreed it. But that's not something I can do. I have to get their consent to do that. So will firms like that work with a portal? They won't know what one is. They won't be bothered with that. We have to go to them sometimes. So I know Mrs. Edge and I have talked about this extensively. The idea of the portal and the quick quote system was entirely laudable. It was designed, I know, to give everybody an equal chance. But some people have stood up for that, and other people seem to have had it go past them.
Can I just come in there and ask? So we have identified that there's something about the system, the process. Is there something else also about how officers involved in procurement? So just can you tell us how many officers there are in DoI who are involved in procurement, roughly?
Without wishing to appear at all unhelpful, Mrs. Paul Wilson, involved in procurement will be almost everyone with a budget. Involved
in administering the process that we're talking about, doing the scoring, doing the specifying.
I would suggest that only 1 or 2 people have it as anything like the majority of their job.
But lots of people...
But, for example, we're about to award a tender to build a bridge. Our senior officer in civil engineering construction will spend his time doing the specification, looking at the bids, working with procurement colleagues to assess those, but his main job is delivering civil engineering. So a large number have it as a small part of their job.
We might have a number of people then who do this every so often.
I would think in my department that could easily be 100 people,
right,
who will do that some of their time.
Okay, so I suppose the question then is what training and enablement do we give to the officers involved? Because you've talked about the importance of specification, we've touched on the importance of how to engage with the private sector, how to maybe engage in design and input before, as part of that specification, and we've talked about the issue of compliance or explain. How are staff trained and enabled to do this well?
In terms of the process overall, there is a standard training approach to the financial regulations and the procurement rules, and everybody in my department who has delegated authority is required to have had the training in the good governance of finances. That's a basic principle of the financial regulations, as you know, that you're accountable. I can't, in all fairness, hold somebody accountable for spend if they've never been trained, so I require that they go on the training course before they have a delegated budget, and I suspect that's common across the organisation. In terms of the interaction with the private sector and the commerciality, certain colleagues build up expertise because of their time in service. So I've had to do things like negotiate the sea services agreement. I've had to buy land from the Peel Group, and I could list other major things I've done. And if you said to me, I've got a major commercial contract that I want someone to negotiate, Nick, I might say, well, if I had the choice, I'd happily help, but I'd choose person A from Treasury and person B from the AGs and person C from DFE, but there is no central team that delivers procurement expertise in sense of commerciality. Procurement officers might say, that doesn't look right to me in terms of value for money, but they don't guide the specification. The department has to set the specification because the department has to know what it wants. Procurement officers will assist us, and their advice is very well respected, but fundamentally I will have to rely on colleagues who have either private sector experience or who have built up extensive public sector experience to be good at that procurement. I don't know of a training course in dealing with the private sector and making sure you get good value for money. If you look at some of the contracts we do, they're immense documents, and I think my colleagues have the competence to go through those, find the loopholes, find the things that aren't right, find the ways that maybe someone was looking to get a better deal than we should give. But that might take them 3 weeks when they're also trying to build a bridge, repair a road, fix this, go to a meeting there, answer a question from somebody there, do the Tynwald answers. So it's part of what we do. Is it the primary focus of anybody's job? At an administrative level, yes, for a few colleagues. At a senior level, probably not.
Okay, thank you.
Just a small thing. You mentioned before about the 3 high-value items. I just wondered, did DoI have any procurement collaborative agreements in place? So where you said the previous order that company had was 1,200. So is there any collaboration, sort of procurement agreements you have in place with companies that are buying on a bigger scale specific to DoI?
So yes is the answer. So we can piggyback onto the CCS UK government contracts. So vehicles in particular, let's take something like transit vans. We might be able to piggyback onto the UK government's contract with Ford to secure better buying power. Right. And there are various schemes like that. In this particular case, no. They're ordered once every 10 years, etc. But you're absolutely right. There are some things. We have taken advantage of what I might perhaps better call a windfall opportunity. Some years ago, I would guess it's 5 years ago, something of that order, we needed to replace 2 buses lost in a flood. And we were able to order 2 on the back of a very similar order that was going through for a large UK provider. So the line didn't have to be changed just to tool up for our spec. And there are actually still 2 buses in our fleet, and I could excite some of you by telling you the numbers. They're 225 and 226 that are built to a slightly different specification with slightly different seats. And if you were a regular passenger, you might notice they're slightly different. To the everyday passenger, they wouldn't be excited enough to notice.
Maybe regret to you, but it doesn't excite me, the numbers. My apologies.
I'm hoping that one of your number might, Mrs. Barber.
Just what we're mentioning about the purchase of transit vans. I mean, again, this might be one of those ones that maybe have got lost in translation, but the police traditionally have been users of transit vans. For the police wagons that put the prisoners in the back. By the time that spec had gone through the DoI, that had been changed to a Mercedes Vito, which wasn't actually big enough to put the cage in the back to put the prisoners in. And that seems to be an example, perhaps, of where either the department's approach to procurement didn't quite match up with the specification that had been originally set.
I think that's perhaps not quite right, Mr. Watterson. There was certainly a discussion about those very vehicles, and I remember it because I spoke to the Chief Constable myself, and we asked him if he would try a Mercedes vehicle. The logic is absolutely, in my view, I thought was very sound. The expensive part of that vehicle is the cage in the back, not the thing it runs around in. And the Mercedes vehicle will last significantly longer, and if you look at FPN, I think it's C.03, Freedom Plant Vehicle Procurement, that talks about the whole life concept, and there's some worked examples there. The Mercedes vehicles cost a little bit more to buy, but they cost less to run over their life. In that particular case, the cost comes in taking the cell unit, if I call it. You refer to it as a cage, I think, but perhaps is not the current phrase, but the prisoner restraint thing, or whatever you call it, out and putting it in another vehicle. that bit lasts for a long time. I have not heard ever that it doesn't fit in the vehicle that they're using. They originally said, that vehicle's too big for us, it'll be too awkward and our officers will knock wing mirrors off, but my understanding is they're in service and there's no problem. I would happily undertake to check if you want, and we can put that on the list of things you want me to check. I have never heard that they don't fit.
Okay.
I just had a question, actually, in terms of, you said there's no one inside the department whose responsibility, whose job it is to basically deal with specifications. But I think you've also kind of quite heavily implied that if that was more focused, you'd get better contracts, you might get better prices, you might get better outcomes. So I suppose the question is why is there no one inside the DoI whose job it is to make sure that this is all done properly as a main part of their job?
We can get advice on specifications from Attorney General's chambers and from the procurement team. They're very generous with their time, they're good in their knowledge, and we can get advice on how to write specifications. I don't recall a situation where anyone in chambers has said, oh, well, that's under 100,000, we won't help. They always help. Right? We've done full tendering for some very low value items if we felt they were going to be quite risky overall. So they're a helpful, positive team, so we can get that advice. But to write the specification, you need to understand the thing you're specifying. So I might have someone who's great at specifying a bus, but they might be rubbish at specifying a bridge contract. So if it's about understanding the general principles, we're better off relying on AGs where they're very, very good at that and making sure that we work together. The end point is what matters, Mr. Hooper, I think, rather than how we get to it. So as long as you have one colleague who says, well, that specification is not good enough, or it needs to be tighter, or that's too ill-defined to attract a proper price, and that's where colleagues in Attorney General's chambers really add value, and they challenge us on that. But as you know, there's a £100,000 threshold.
So how do you make sure then that what goes out to tender is the most relevant and most appropriate solution to the problem you're trying to solve? What is it? How do you make sure that the outcome, because that is the key part of the process, how do you make sure that the outcome you're asking for in that tender document is the outcome that you actually want?
The only way we could solve that is by putting in some form of step in the lower value contracts that made sure that we'd done that right each time. And as with all matters of governance, it's, if you like, a counterpoint or a support to competence. So, as in so many areas of our working world, there's so much that people can do because it's within their skill set, knowledge and experience, their overall competence, and there's so much that needs to be imposed on them as rules that must be followed and checked. And we've got to get the value right. We've got to get this balance right. I'm not going to say that DoI has got that absolutely right and that we're a leading light and an example to others. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we work with Attorney General's chambers colleagues to make sure our specifications are as good as they can be, but that tends to be for the higher value items because they're the ones that carry the most risk. And indeed that high value approach is reflected in the procurement policy, isn't it?
Do you not think that perhaps government sometimes over-specifies its requirements? So quite often the best people who know, like you say, you need to know about bridges to get a bridge specification right. Well, quite often the people who know about bridges are the people that build them. So would it not make more sense actually to have a slightly broader outcomes-focused specification and engage more with then the private sector on actually how do we deliver this, as opposed to specifying at the outset, I want this colour and this size and this make? Would you not be better specifying the actual outcome you're trying to achieve and then developing that specification alongside a private sector partner?
So we do that in certain circumstances, and perhaps you don't want to spend hours listening to the NEC suite of contracts and the endless variations of contracts that are used for engineering and civil engineering construction. But design and build contracts are an option there. Design, build and operate contracts are an option there. Just design, just build. So we absolutely can go to design and build, and if you look at some of the ones, we either specify an output, we've built some low energy houses. So the main aim there was to find someone who would achieve the target of that low energy silver standard. There are others like that. It's probably
I'll give you a low-level example from a few years ago in terms of, I think it was fixing your steam trains, it might have been, and the contract that went out, or the tender that went out, was very specific as to the actions you wanted the contractor to take, whereas the outcome you're looking for was someone to fix the train. And I remember being approached by someone who had put in for the contract, basically saying, well, I can do that piece of work, but I can't complete the tender documentation to what they're asking for, because what they're asking for, in his view, made no sense. And so actually you may not have ended up with the best outcome there because you actually specified the work you wanted doing as opposed to actually the outcome needs to be this needs to be running.
And I can probably understand the situation you're referring to, but we won't use any names. The difficulty we have there, and it's not insurmountable, the difficulty is if it's the same gentleman we're thinking of, I reckon he could fix it and I reckon he could do a good job. right? If it were my personal steam locomotive, you're pleased to know I don't have one, I would absolutely trust him to do a good job. But how do I then know that I've paid a fair price? Because there's nobody else on the island who can do that work. So other companies in the UK would have to price. And what we do is we break down the work so we can test and evaluate it, and we can then say, yes, that was done. With something like a steam locomotive, and I'm reaching already the limits of my understanding of steam locomotive technology, how do we know that some of the parts inside were changed? We don't. But if we've specified each step to be done, and we've checked and we've gone back to the supplier and visited, there are ways around it, you're right, Mr. Hooper. We could have gone up every Friday afternoon to say, show me what you've done this week.
I think what I'm getting at is this comes down again to that value versus cost. You know, the value is having the thing working, not necessarily having had all the individual bits replaced, and so the contract specification really should have been more about it needs to be working at the end of the day, as opposed to I need you to have undertaken the following steps.
With warranty.
And warranty is perhaps the solution to the quality. If you don't do a good job, we'll be claiming under the warranty.
In fear of running contrary to my esteemed colleague to my left here in terms of equality issues, the discussion that we're having sort of reminds me of that old phrase that women are from Venus and men are from Mars, and it's the issue about how you integrate a bureaucratic system with the private sector that I think we're trying to examine here. I think if after the end of this session we end up feeling that we've just sat here criticising what is, I think it's an opportunity lost, because I prefer to see us engaged in how can we make it better, rather than necessarily criticising, as it were, what is. So on that basis, you said something earlier on about how firms from away, because one of the issues of feedback that I've personally been getting in preparation for this meeting is the sense that a number of local suppliers have that there's a preference for away suppliers, and you've just described to me how that actually happens. In other words, there are organisations across who might be dealing with 30 public local authorities, for example, in a way that our local people haven't got the opportunity to do that. They've just got the one, and they're sort of small. And if we just simply said, oh, unless they can comply with the standard that the bureaucratic process, the political process requires, then they're not in the game, then would you accept the point that that needs some study as to how we could get round that, so that we're opening the door more for local businesses to engage? Because there are significant advantages, I'm sure you would agree, without us even discussing it, that laying a taxpayer's pound within the economy here has massive, significant advantage. It's not that we're sitting here saying you should be doing this or that. I think we're in a learning curve here ourselves. The whole system is a learning curve. And would you like to sort of comment on that? Have you thought about how it might be possible to re-engineer this to allow more local businesses to come into the process? That's my first point.
Yes, Mr. Robert Shaw, the answer is yes, we have considered that. Our initial approach to that is that we should think about the scope of our tenders and the scope of our contracts. So we could, for example, place, and I'll simply use an example that was on the list sent as a possible item, though with some trepidation. If we look about servicing fire extinguishers across the whole government portfolio, would we be better off having 4 sets of buildings or 4 types of property? Should we do all education ones is lot A? Should health ones be lot B and DoI ones be lot C? Allowing firms who perhaps aren't huge to say, well, actually, that's now within my grasp, I could do that, I can keep up with that. So that would help the local firms. The other way is the one I referred to earlier, where potentially there is a value to the taxpayer in having one highly skilled, long-term contractor. And if we could incentivise a local firm to, if you like, train, develop and purchase for that, then I think that would add value. So that means that we have to go for longer contracts, and we have to potentially say what would stop local firms. So Let me take what might be a simplistic example, hedge cutting. As you know, the department cuts hedges for safety around the island, with the support of local authorities. But if you just take our bit of it, would we be better continuing the sort of low level approach whereby we might say, oh, will you cut that and will you cut that? Should we have a regional contract with you get the hedges for the north for 3 years, or should we have an all-island contract for 7 years? The person who gets it is going to be happy, the person who isn't. So it's very hard to say what the right answer is. Now, in a way, to answer your question, as long as the pound is a local pound, in a way, it doesn't matter. So whether it's a chap from the north or a lady from the south doesn't matter as long as they're both the Manx pound. And it's not a UK firm that's come in and said, oh, I do hedges all across the northwest, I'm going to just take yours as well. So I think, again, we're there about saying, what is the policy, what are we trying to achieve? But if we maximise local contribution, there's a fear that you've heard it, I think you've heard it yourself, it's been mentioned in Tynwald, that local firms would just, if we publish the figure of what it's worth to spend locally, and if you said to me, do you agree, Nick, it's X%, then local firms might be tempted to add X%. But they might not, because it depends if it's truly competitive. For some of our services, typically we're getting 1 or 2 bids now. So the construction sector is very busy across all skills, all trades, through to finishing to civil engineering. We've recently done some work to improve accessibility at our bus stops. It's an important issue for us, and we had to twice place the opportunity onto the procurement system for people to do that work. It's not complex in engineering terms. It's aligning the curbs and doing some paving works. Nobody wanted the work. So
I think, with the respect, I think you're drifting off my question. It was about the concept of the degree of bureaucratic process required by a private sector firm to, as it were, find itself capable of interacting with what is essentially a bureaucratic process.
Let me come to that, Mr. Roberts.
So
private sector
come back to
that. With some frequency, will say to me, "You're too hard to deal with. You're too slow to reply. It's just too difficult. Why do you keep asking for bits of paper?" But we work in an environment with very strong governance because we're spending the public's money. If it were my business and I was wanting someone to fix my fire extinguishers, I'd be making my choice and I could get 3 prices and get on and do that. I could take 1 price if I had a friend who had fire extinguisher firms. We're spending the public's money. So governance is always going to be a primacy and value for money to make sure not only, remember, as an officer, you're doing 2 things. You're trying to get best value for money, but you're also trying to make sure you can show you did.
Yeah, but that's the bureaucratic process. What I'm asking you, have you guys thought this through and tried to think of ways to speed it up? Because you've happily indicated that how slow this process can be. Is there anything that you think that you can help this committee consider about how we could recommend this process becoming less UK-style, follow-the-procedure, bureaucratic? Because what we all want, you and me and everybody else, wants to bring as many local companies into this process as we can possibly achieve.
For our work, the answer probably lies in framework contracts. So that we go out early, we say we're likely to need X amount of work done over Y amount of years, and we're not taking a single best price. We're saying, pre-qualify for this, show us you can do the work, show us you're competent, show us you're safe, show us you meet all our standards, and when we want the work done, we'll write to you or we'll give you a week to give us a price. So that, I think, would help. But it requires, much like the questions asked earlier, it requires an investment of officer time, of quite a lot of time, to set those up. You reap the benefit over years, because you could have a 5-year list, and we've got some of those for consultants, for example.
So you're in favour of the concept, it's just the ability to deliver it then, is that what you're saying?
I absolutely am in favour of the concept, okay. But as you know, we have colleagues doing a whole range of urgent tasks on a whole range of priority items, and I have to find time to release them for that.
I get that.
That's not impossible, Mr. Roberts. Sure, it's just a priority.